And we are live. I am joined by the ever wonderful Orthodox fisherman and geopolitics aficionado, the Prudentialist. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing quite well this evening. Thank you for having me on.
Now, it was my pleasure. I wanted to bring someone on who knew a lot about geopolitics but wasn't cringe, which you can find in a lot of abundance in today's world with people giving their standard narrative talking points about geopolitics from a CIA talking points sheet, pretty much.
Well, there's always going to be people that put out narratives, whether it's for their own government purpose, state of nature, their own grift. Everyone's got something to sell. I just try my best to read through my abundant list of JSTOR articles, books, and try and make sense. And if I wasn't right the first time, I will go back and get it right the second time.
Definitely, that is important. And when we talk about geopolitics, can you kind of explain what that is in principle? Like, what does that mean? Because we've heard a lot of kind of things about what that means. People say it's power politics, it's great powers. What does that mean?
Well, geopolitics is really just the application and understanding of geography in relation to international politics and relations, especially how states conduct their foreign policy. Not to be too much of a geographic determinist, but nation states, as we primarily view them in today's world of international relations, have to be cognizant of their geography, whether that's within regards to warfare, trade, travel, and their own national security. So, understanding where mountain ranges are, where vital natural resources are, the topography of a certain region of your own respective country will play a major role in how you conduct foreign policy with other countries, but also how you posture yourself in regards to national security and defense. I mean, geopolitics literally has it in the name and has a huge emphasis on geography. And when we take a look at how nations respond to, say, territorial annexation, foreign incursions, or even transnational terrorist organizations, they have to keep geography in mind because sometimes in today's day and age, things are not just situated inside the borders of one country. They can come from all sorts of places.
Indeed, and you kind of like geography, like is something that doesn't really change a lot. So the elites of every nation like have to think about this on a strategic like chessboard, as we like to say, the grand chessboard. Um, and based on like kind of what you got is based on kind of what you're going to be focused on fighting for and like what your limitations are. So like mountain ranges, rivers, oil fields, coal mines, farmland, all these things come into the big picture when it comes to the calculation of if say invading a country is worth it, or starting a proxy war might be worth it for a regime change, which could potentially benefit you. Maybe secure your own geographical security interests there as well.
Well, I mean, you also have to keep in mind that most nations will always seek their own security first. This is sort of the basic tenet of most schools of thought in regards to international relations, is that just much like a human being has sort of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, nation states, as we view them today, with a government, a standing military, a population that calls itself a respective territory or nation's ethnicity, has a tax base, has collective businesses, can conduct trade, they always have to pursue that almighty need, which is going to be defensive sovereignty. And how can you maintain your sovereignty in the face of rivaling powers and international relations? This is why that because there is no sort of global kingly authority or no global leader or mastermind that rules over everything, at least on this earth. I mean, there's no God on Earth in regards to telling which countries can do X, Y, and Z. You know, as much as we want the UN to say do that for us, that's not the case.
Or the WEF.
Yeah, right. And so you have to, as a respective nation state, for instance, AP, if you were in charge of a country like, say, Montenegro or say South Sudan, you're going to have to keep in mind that some of your issues are going to be about, well, you're surrounded by much larger, more populous states, and you have certain geographic restrictions, whether that may be potentially being a landlocked country or limited access to resources. And so your sovereignty is what's going to come first, and how do you maintain that? Some people maintain it through a rigorous national defense and posture with a large standing military. Others may pursue it through diplomatic and economic alliances, which can ensure their survival. So, I mean, that's sort of the first thing that any nation state has to look at in today's global environment is how do I maintain sovereignty?
Yes, sovereignty, resources are paramount in terms to your position on the chessboard. And it's kind of why the US actually is the number one world's power is based on just the sheer the sheer greatness of our geography. Some of the best farmland in the world, the Mississippi River Basin, which allows for the cheapest form of transportation known to man, which is water. Roads are degraded and are hard to maintain. It's the cheapest, and you can transport food from the Midwest all the way down to the port of New Orleans and ship it out to tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. Tremendous amounts of natural oil, and as well as our new techniques to crack shell oil has blessed us with immense amounts of resources of natural oil. So that is no longer a concern either. And your geography will determine your power on the global chessboard. Like there's a
absolutely. I mean, for an example, right, would be sort of our relationship with Mexico is fundamentally shifted based upon geography. For example, I mean, as soon as Texas joins the Union in 1845, just a few months later in 1846, the Mexican-American War sends off, and in turn, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, for example, radically reduces the territorial size in terms of just pure square mileage of Mexico. I mean, they're more or less cut out from accessing the Pacific Ocean via California, and so states eventually, plus the Gadsden Purchase that would have come later, would lead to states like Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and California, not to mention Texas, all joining the Union. So you have really now the creation of the Continental 48, significantly weakened military power to your south. And in turn, you know, America has all those vast natural resources that would not only lead to great mineral wealth and resource extraction, but also things like the Transcontinental Railroad, which fundamentally connected the two coasts of the country and brought the nation to a more pronounced power on the world stage.
Yeah, as well as not having any serious rivalry in our own backyard. Your geographic neighbors will also kind of determine the limits of expansion or defense, whether you will be in the offensive or defensive position there. Um, Surely just based on limitations of the weakness of who's around you and what they're playing with will determine your stance on things in a general sense. Mexico and Canada could never challenge us in any real way ever, and they're basically U.S. allies or puppet states, depending on your point of view. So you don't have to worry about your own backyard. So that's why you can focus primarily on the broader sphere, because the home front is secure. And once that's concerned, you can focus on these extraterritorial conflicts for more resources, more power gain, or defending allies for any reason, basically, because you just don't have that need or that concern.
Well, you still have that concern as technology evolves, that to certainly say the least. I mean, things have only gotten increasingly more complex, and in a system that is innately anarchic, you do need to be capable of threats and manage them well beyond your borders. I mean, for any criticism that can be levied on the United States' foreign policy, and plenty of them are fair, the one thing that can't be said against the United States is that in an anarchic world system, wherein, again, there is no global sovereignty, I said nations will inevitably pursue hegemony. And in doing so, the United States has successfully done that per our understanding of, you know, the more functionalist or even sort of new realism that we sort of see today that is often quite popular, especially in individuals in our circles.
Definitely getting into that kind of the basics of geopolitics. There's also schools around this. You, of course, have the neocons, whose solution to everything is to bomb it and invade the country to establish liberal democracy, because it will work this time if you just bomb it. If you just bomb it in the right way. Then you got the more realist solution, which is kind of like, hey, We should recognize other countries have extraterritorial needs. They got geographical needs here, and we should kind of work with that. Kind of be more realistic about things. Then you have pie in the sky people, people at the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, who will say that everything is going fine, and we can continue the great big gay parade, can continue on, and that's the best form of foreign policy.
Well, you do have maybe four major schools of international relations that sort of break down, at least today in the 21st century. You do have more of the traditional liberal form of international relations and how policy may be conducted. This, often gets associated with the sort of Wilsonian idealism about sort of making the world "quote unquote" safe for democracy. You have these sort of aspects for a rules-based order, liberal institutionalism, as it's known. Most famously, there's a New York Times columnist by the name of Thomas E. Friedman who had wrote literally months before the conflict in Bosnia had really started off in the early 1990s, was on the idea that of democratic peace theory, or even capitalist peace, where no two nations with a McDonald's had ever gone to war with each other, which he had sort of had his own idea thrown in his face just a few months later. But sort of what we see primarily from the West is a much more liberal understanding of the world. But you have three others. Primarily, you have sort of a Marxist system, which that's where you get the concept of, for instance, world systems theory or world systems analysis that comes from primarily Wallerstein back in the 1970s, which his work is definitely worth reading if you want to understand sort of the realist aspect of trading status and how it's based upon more resource extraction, which there is some truth to how that operates. Then you have, of course, realism, which has been mainly seen in sort of neo-realism, which has been popularized by individuals like Kenneth Waltz in the 1970s, more popularly known with the idea of offensive realism that comes from that by John J. Mearsheimer. Although there are plenty of other offensive and other realist scholars, such as Stephen M. Walt, Dr. Sumantra Mitra, and others. And then, of course, you have constructivism, which is probably the most interesting one, in part because I think that this school of thought is still really being developed. It only kind of emerges from people like Nicholas Orniff and Scott Fearden, where they talk about the idea that the way that we construct these things, these social constructs of what is a rules-based system, what do we consider norms? In fact, the idea is that really we have to understand that power politics as we know it, they're going to be different based upon how other nations view or interpret those terms. So they try to understand how we can't always just question these assumptions. These assumptions can't be taken for granted. We have to understand that they do come from social constructions based upon populations that have power. So I mean, this school has really emerged as a critique of the realist school of Kenneth Waltz and Mearsheimer and the rest. It's been an interesting thing to see emerge, and people will play with it. But those are your four real major schools. I mean, you have the political stuff like neoconservatism, or really what I would associate it with is what the historian John G. Eikenberry, he's called this more or less the concept of liberal hegemony, that if you can expand your hegemony by more or less homogenizing other countries into a liberal state, in turn, you can increase your likelihood that you're not going to be attacked again, because if the same political model and formula is in other countries, why would they fight to change it? I would argue that that goes back a little further, probably since the late 1890s with the Spanish-American War and sort of the United States' first foray into Central American and Latin American affairs. But I mean, then there are some that debate that it even goes back to having a more loose and lax interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, which I've covered on my channel before, because that has its own interesting history with regards to American foreign policy.
Definitely. I believe the realist school has kind of drawn attention, especially from our side, because people are starting to understand like this stuff kind of matters. Like kind of the thinking of your elites and like how you should navigate geopolitics and policy is very important. As we all know, elites make all of these decisions. there is zero correlation with what the public wants, what actually gets put into law there. And so the thinking of your elites on like how the world functions and kind of your position on the chessboard, so to speak, is very important because that will be the results you get ultimately with the use of blood and treasure, essentially. This is based on their view. And I believe that Barry Posen, you reviewed his book about restraint, had a very good point about that.
Well, realism's got an important aspect that the elites can't always or forever ignore what some of the people want, and they'll have to eventually play into it to some degree, or at least satiate them, because even realists will acknowledge in the same way that sort of the constructivists or even the Marxists in international relations will tell you is that at a certain point you can't let the material conditions degrade to a point where things get put you at risk, either as a leader or your national security. I mean, for instance, right, John J. Mearsheimer, probably one of the most famous living international relations scholars in the West, he was a supporter of Bernie Sanders in both the 2020 and 2016 election. I mean, he still has a lot of critiques of liberalism in his work, but at the same time, he's very much still a baby boomer who has some certain views, and those things do play a role into how he conducts his understanding of the world stage. And so, for instance, he will take the argument that America's economic situation domestically is a national security concern, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. Probably not for the same reasons that Mearsheimer does with supporting Bernie Sanders, but it does play a role in that. But realism is a wide variety of schools of thought. But I mean, you do have these sort of four basic sort of conceits that decision makers, policymakers, elites are going to play a role in. And what makes today's foreign policy so interesting is that you sort of have, it's not singular actors, right? Like it's not just the United States government through the United States Department of State or is going to do X, Y, and Z, because you can apply multilateral, multi-domain pressure to ensure that you can achieve a certain policy goal or position. But realism usually has, say, four key concepts, primarily that your focus and your thinking is to think like a nation state, to think like the country. Two, as I mentioned earlier, it's always going to be anarchic. Three, and this is probably the biggest concern on the international stage, and this is where there's a lot of criticism, I guess, on realism, is that it does put a lot of assumption that nation states and world leaders act rationally. And then fourth, of course, is the desire for power and to ensure hegemony, security, sovereignty, what have you.
Yeah, I think that third point we can pretty much disagree at this point, as we saw with the COVID regime and the insanity that followed that. The leaders do not do things that are rational. They do things based on politic and staying face because they don't want to be wrong or perceived to be wrong, for getting credit to alternative points of view on things, which produces bad decisions, which go further down the chain of power and command there.
I mean, potentially in a lot of ways. I mean, if I were to think in regards to, say, how government responded to, say, that crisis, right? I'm trying to play it nice for YouTube purposes, but I mean, I'm sure that they've got their own sense of logic that would apply to it, not only as a method and mechanism to quell on political dissent, but also because it's easy to weaponize one population against another. We see this a lot when, I mean, there's countless studies and meta-analyses that will tell you that the more diverse a society is, the less likely its social cohesion is to be maintained, and the idea of a civic authority will be decreased in trust. I mean, even there are numerous books on terrorism, one of which I covered from a 2004 text called Fatal Future, the New Global Disorder. It sort of talks about how in those kind of environments it can be significantly weakened. And so you have to understand, well, how can you placate populations that will, either riot or that you can enable to riot to secure political ends? I mean, especially when they have a whole system of, well, obviously the guy in the White House is an existential threat or a national security threat or a traitor to the country. I mean, most of these, of course, can be post hoc rationalizations. Others can be, there are ways of securing power. I mean, that's the internal politics of a country also applies to its national security. This is how successfully can you defend a nation in a sort of pluralistic system. And I think that that's going to be a challenge that the U.S. will face for some time, especially as our politics in America kind of gets closer and closer to that nice low intensity conflict that a lot of security and analysts, both on the left and the right, are talking about. But yeah, I mean, elites are going to find their own mechanisms and see things vastly different than, say, someone who lives in the podunk middle of nowhere or lives in Gary, Indiana.
Well, yeah, because they're invested in the system maintaining itself, because that's how they got there. It's their position of power. I mean, as we see with a bunch of these biological, just biological Leninist cretins that are now in positions of power in society that they would have never have been in any sane world, purely because of the system and loyalty expressly to that. So they're going to, of course, be loyal to it, and punish and suppress anything that is or is perceived to be a threat to the system of maintaining power and their place in the hierarchy. Again, Aaron McIntyre likes to say this thing all the time. It's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a phrase I think ripped from Adrian Vermeule, if I recall correctly. But I mean, it's a very good one to keep in mind, because that sort of realpolitik Machiavellianism applies just as much domestically as it does abroad in an international relations geopolitics sense. And those are things that people can't be remiss of. And while there is certainly the bio-Leninist factor that Spandrel has famously discussed in his three-part blog series on it, and he's also been on Blood Satellite to discuss it more. I mean, America still does have a really well-entrenched sort of heritable genetic aristocracy of all kinds. I mean, the New York Times is probably one of the most well-known public examples that it's been more or less in the hands of the same family for a century and maintains that and plays it to its strengths and advantages. But I mean, most of our government bureaus, elites, and the media have a borderline royal incestuous relationship with one another in terms of marriages, which families they come from. I mean, this is the interesting thing, is just that, for example, right, the Sam Bankman-Fried thing with FTX is that you also had well-established family members in some of the elite power institutions of the country. Things like, for example, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or another example would be like the University of Chicago, which you've had everyone from John J. Mearsheimer to Milton Friedman to Richard Spencer all attend that university, and there are plenty of others. I think that most recent individual, Daniel Schmidt, that kid who interviewed Tucker Carlson, goes there. So, I mean, there is still a significant amount of institutions where one can either become an elite, or that's where they go to sort of have that status coronated upon them. And those individuals tend to be the ones that will help conduct foreign policy, not just our domestic ones.
Yes, and you would hope it would be sane people coming out of there, but most of the time you get the machine just cranking out John Boltons of the world, essentially. The only difference being the other side just wants pride flags on the bombs. Pretty much, this is the only difference, and I think that's pretty much true. The conclusions and means to get there are the same in their worldview, and that is the problem.
Well, to some degree, although I think that, of course, Bolton would take maybe a different approach with regards to how the current administration is handling, say, policy in the Middle East. I mean, there is still that David Frum axis of evil mentality that has also been just a long-standing part of America's foreign policy position inside of the Middle East, whether that's its relationship to Iraq, both prior and after Saddam Hussein, but also with regards to Iran. I mean, shaped by the revolution at the end of the 1970s and followed by America's growing interest in sort of this pan-Arabic and including Israel into this, because that was a big part of the Trump administration, was pursuing a Israeli pan-Arabic coalition in regards to Iran, primarily through Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and it all plays a large role there. But I mean, there is some differences, although I think it's important. Most of the end of the day, yes, they are going to be vastly interventionist, but the ideas have just melded with the times. We went from, we're going to kick ass and we're going to spread democracy and we're going to liberate these people from dictators, to now we're liberating people from dictators so they can have access to the same kind of
More gay
freedoms that we
pride
have.
parades.
Yeah, things like that. I mean, not to shill too hard, but I mean, I have a video on my channel talking about deterritorialization and American soft power. I mean, that's a big part of sort of America's foreign policy institutions. This is that if you can deracinate or deterritorialize a specific culture, an institution, a political norm, and reterritorialize it, recapture it with your own, I mean, that could be a big focus. And that's why, as Glenn Greenwald has documented, I mean, there was a lot of media and narrative shifts around 2011 after the troop surge in Afghanistan to really make it an emphasis on things like women's education, and then later on gay rights, and so on and so forth, to where nowadays we still have a few fluff pieces and articles out there today where it's like, well, we can lament the fall of, say, women's education in Kabul and Afghanistan.
Yeah, the pure tragedy of that women will not be in charge of schools or colleges in Afghanistan. Yeah. And the billions of dollars that we spent there and lives wasted to prop that system up is an immense tragedy in their minds.
It is certainly something that requires, I think, a much more full dissection. I think one of the best articles written on sort of the Afghan war has been an article called Data Driven Defeat, which you can find in the American Affairs Journal, which talks about sort of a lack of a clear win condition, numerous organizations and parts of the government that had varying different interests, and at the same time, of course, the great tragedy of blood and treasure being wasted.
Yeah, especially in a pointless war that benefited not America, but of course benefited the elites. But moving on to a different subject, let's talk about Peter Zion for a quick second. Peter Zion has recently been kind of gaining more prominence recently. He's been on Joe Rogan, a couple of other high-profile podcasts, and a couple of local networks, mainly discussing China is the big thing that he's kind of blowing up for, discussing China's demographic problems, and that we shouldn't be worried about China in the long run. But he is more realistic about the state of globalism and that we cannot maintain the system forever with our deteriorating navy, and just like the lack of planning to maintain the complex system that we have.
Well, I'm currently reading his latest book, his 2022 book, The End of the World is Just Beginning, where he sort of documents some of his concerns about a catabolic collapse sort of situation, sort of the same thing that others like Ebert and Greer have discussed before in their works and in their ideas. However, I can't say I'm terribly familiar, actually. I mean, this has been sort of my fault. I've been starting to read more of his work. I haven't watched his Joe Rogan appearance, but he does lay out a rather interesting case that the current system as we know it politically, by nature of supply chain issues, the ability to maintain and educate individuals into how our systems are going to operate, that it is not likely to last forever. So I guess if you're one of those sort of doomer optimists, he might be your guy. But his view on China is to be, he has that very much 19th century, understanding of how the world works, which I mean is fine in some degree. I don't think I saw that Joe Rogan clip though that was going around on Twitter about his conversation on cryptocurrency, and I found that to be particularly interesting because it's always easy to spot someone when they're talking out of their depth, because he sort of had a rather he sort of dismisses how likely that technology can be used, while I'm still rather optimistic that we haven't found the fullness of what, say, blockchain technology can be used for in some ways in regards to cryptographically exchanging information. But I find him interesting, and I've been reading his book, his new one, on my PDF that I have of it. It's like 600 pages long, but I'm about like a third of the way through, and I find him to have a grim sense of like realism of that the liberal order as he knows it, based upon how he can maintain a current standard of living and a quality of life for a lot of people, is not long for this world. And I guess we're only going to see that play out despite all the advances or the investment in American infrastructure. You still see issues of like what happens in Jackson, Mississippi, the current state of America's road and rail conditions, and that we're also going to face a significant shortage when it comes to, say, demographics here in the country. I mean, he talks about this in China, Europe, Africa, and the United States in this book. And it's interesting because it reminded me of a 2018 book called Empty Planet, where like the real demographic crisis is that we're going to hit the highest number of peak population on the earth, right? And somewhere towards the latter half of the 21st century, but it's only going to go down. And we're going to have a much smaller world population into the next century. And so I think things are headed for a very interesting arc of world history that we, of course, won't live to see. But I think we will see the seeds of its evolution, change, and potential destruction be planted here.
Yeah, he's very interesting. He says he's an Atlanticist on his policy, but he's just realistic that like we don't have enough corvettes and destroyers. Oh, this was a good point he made. We don't have enough corvettes or destroyers in our navy to maintain global control of the oceans and maintain the current trade routes, and that we're just not keeping pace with China. There just isn't enough of them, and there isn't that will to kind of do that anymore, or even to maintain the state of the navy that we have now to make that even possible. So he is realistic that like as you like your ability to maintain force and maintain the system deteriorates, like obviously you cannot maintain that system. So he is realistic. However, he is kind of still he is an Atlanticist in the end of the day, but he is realistic about demographics and things. Although I'm not quite sure if he's fully right about China. He's one of these people who thinks that China will never be a threat and that basically they're just going to poof, go away. And yeah, he brings up good points, but I don't know. I think that they probably do have the strength for one last, probably big engagement, probably over Taiwan, most likely. But we'll see. I could be wrong about that, but I think they have enough Chinamen to do that still.
Well, the demographics question with regards to China is always interesting because there is a lot of literature that goes back to the 1990s that sort of forecasts this same sort of issue. And we haven't, there's always been the sort of memeable, quote unquote, not happening gang that like, nothing's going to happen, like it's not going to be a big deal, things are going to go on as normal. And I do think to some degree you are going to see a certain demographic issue in the country, both in regards to one, culture, two, but also by a raw number of people that are getting older. I mean, China does not have the same sort of social security or elderly benefits as the United States or other Western countries do. And so you have a cultural expectation to take care of them. Well, you have a population roughly one half, if not a little more, roughly 175 to 180 million people that are over the age of 65 in China. The question is, well, how many of them are still working, on top of the fact that you still have to take care of them? Additionally, that you have the crackdowns that they're facing with, say, access to social media, how many video games they can play and things like that. A lot of people in the West might scoff at this in their attempts to sort of quote unquote clamp down on hedonism. But to me, the real interesting theory is that did they excise the tumor, quote unquote, like say of the quote unquote, of like the pause, right? Did they cut it out so soon, or is it already still in this body politic, and will it metastasize? Because you do have a lot of Chinese individuals that do study, for instance, in American and Western universities, where they do kind of get that chock full of progressivism, and a lot of them do come back. And does that play a role in regards to how the culture for ordinary Chinese individuals will play out? I mean, there's still also the issue of people that don't get married or don't have kids. Their birth rates are falling in regards to the total fertility rate at a similar position as India's is. So I believe they are well below replacement levels. I think they're like 1.74 last I checked. And so their question is always going to be, did you make your prediction too early, or is something going to change radically inside of China's domestic politics that would encourage a resumption of birth rates? I mean, they're going to face the same issues that Japan and other countries do, that these highly industrialized societies often tend to see a decrease in their birth rates, but can they prop them back up to a sustainable replacement level? And so far, that question remains to be seen, especially for their more westernized counterparts like South Korea and Japan.
Yeah, as we've seen, trying to raise the birth rate once it goes below that magic 2.1 number is extraordinarily difficult. And even with extensive family incentivizing programs like Hungary or A German friendly told me that they had these in like the 50s or 60s to incentivize women to have more kids. It's extremely difficult. And I believe that there's only been one example of a country doing that. And I believe it was Georgia, but I'm not quite sure. Um,
Well, I
Raising it
mean,
back up to 2.1.
Francisco Franco, in his time ruling Spain, had managed to successfully stabilize the country's birth rate from seeing a further precipitous decline. But I mean, every nation's going to have different socio-political and cultural factors that are going to play a role there. I mean, Hungary has recently moved under Viktor Orban's government to help incentivize this. I mean, both the Soviet Union and mid-century Germany under that regime had also incentivized higher levels of birth rates, and also an attempt to restock the population after a bloody revolution in regards to the Soviet Union's case, but as well as the First World War and Germany and the rest of Europe. So it really will depend on how we can see incentives to do so. Incentives won't go so far, right? Like, taking an extra $1,000 off the child tax credit, for example, is not enough when you still have inflation, a economic environment that really requires you to work and be a parent. And at the same time, where the good money is in this country are primarily in cities or in lower suburban areas where you can easily commute or work from home to make a good living. And that's also going to play a major factor there, because that's the other half of what Spandrels talked about, is the IQ shredder. And the individuals in that book I mentioned earlier, Empty Planet, they'll talk about things like, well, really the solution that you're going to have to solve for the demography crisis will have to be immigration. There's going to be a fight over immigration. But at the same time, right, our system of economics and our system of how we organize and stratify the economy encourages massive urban shift to where you move there, things are expensive, things are hard to maintain. Ergo, we've got to, we can't afford to have kids, so we have fewer kids. And so smart people that would have probably had children in other countries, now they're here in, say, the United States, in a city like New York or Los Angeles, where they're not having kids, and the potential of having smarter offspring or intelligent offspring that could produce, great work has disappeared. And so, you're not only causing brain drain, but you're just shredding the IQ of this place, because you have to bring in more people in, and eventually you're going to run out of the smart ones. And in turn, it's only going to make the more or less the greater part of that region, in the aggregate, more dumb, and or at least have an average IQ that's less than what it was originally. So we're going to be facing some interesting, biological, genetic, and social concerns that absolutely the birth rate needs to be raised. Otherwise, all that you're going to have is this vast swath of territory that is more like a tourist trap shopping mall than anything else, not really a respective country.
Yeah, and that's the way our elite Sierra country is basically a glorified shopping mall with gay pride flags in the middle, pretty much. Um,
Well, I mean, that's going to be the kind of concern that we have to face. I mean, that's the domestic politics side of it, right? This is that how does the right manifest a winning vision, primarily because so much of the right wing today exists in this via negativo, we are what we aren't kind of space. And at the same time, how can you provide a networked incentive structure that will encourage certain demographics, political groups, ideologies to thrive, reproduce, not just in terms of quote unquote red pilling people, but also because you have children that you can take to church, or believe the same things you do in a community sort of centered form of living. And right now I don't know how much of the right has that. There's been a lot of debate and discourse over what ideas can win, where do we go from here, but at a certain point in time, as my friend Ernst van Zyl will tell you, there's sometimes you just have to dig a trench and kind of stay in it for the long haul. And I think that that's where a lot of countries are going to be going, is that, well, what do you do in the midst of, well, in order to make it, you kind of have to bring more people in. And in fact, that was a huge complaint during the latter years of the Roman Empire, is that there was a vast amount of Middle Eastern of a population coming in. I mean, Marcus Aurelius was more or less one of the last sort of Italian-born emperors in that era. A lot of them else were from more Middle Eastern or Southern Mediterranean descent. They weren't necessarily of the old Roman stock.
Yeah, that is quite an interesting quandary we face there. We require complex solutions to solve it, but I fully agree with what Ernst said there. Like, you can't just endlessly retreat. You have to make a stand. Otherwise, once you run out of space to retreat, well, now you're pretty much surrounded, and that's the end for you. And there's no other option because you didn't like make a stand at least somewhere. Like eventually, you have to face the enemy. You have to do something. Endlessly retreating is a recipe for succumbing to the inevitable conclusion that, well, we'll be defeated anyway, so we might as well just retreat now, and it will come in 10 years later, but I'll still have 10 years, which is a very terrible mindset to have because we need those people to do something productive now. At least do something, you know what I mean? This isn't a healthy mindset to have.
Yeah, I would agree with you in that. You can't have a mindset that sort of fetishizes decline, or that someone enjoys it a little too much. Is almost as if Charlie Brown really enjoyed the grief a little too much. But the same thing would have to apply for anyone that wants to prospectively turn the country around, politically speaking, or even internationally speaking. I mean, if you wanted to improve America's global image, or you wanted to have countries stop doing what's known as buck passing, right? So this was something that Donald Trump was actually sort of calling out during his term in office, was that, you know, traditionally institutions like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States primarily is the one that foots the bill, and that Western countries, particularly in Europe, Germany being a prominent example, Luxembourg, France, etc., they didn't meet their 2% GDP requirement on defense spending, and in part making sure that they're able-bodied and ready for NATO. And this was something that has always been known, and Mearsheimer talks about this in his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which came out in 1991, about how those countries will just pass the buck to the United States, the larger power, the larger economy. And he was very apt to sort of call that out. And I mean, even in Barry Posen's book, Restraint, which came out in 2018, he was also very adamant about sort of making sure that whatever the U.S. does in the future with regards to its foreign policy, it can't foot the bill for everybody. And even more establishment, neoconservative sort of thinkers, and I don't even know if I would call him a neoconservative. I mean, it's just a different form of disaffected liberalism in some sense. But even the former president of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard M. Haas, in his 2014 book, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, he talks about the need that if you don't get the domestic house in order, especially financially, then you aren't going to be able to foot the bill for other countries. And in doing so, you also have to tell other countries to start paying their fair share. Otherwise, these are expenditures that eventually we will unable to pay for and can't spend on.
Yeah, it's quite like the late stage Roman Empire, where it's extremely difficult to defend these eastern provinces that you have. They're extremely far away from the core heartland, and they're extremely expensive to maintain troops in and govern and prop up social orders and make sure the elites are on your side in case a war breaks out with Persia over Syria or something like that. And eventually, as the competency and just population decays, like you can't maintain that. That isn't attainable. If you don't have your A game, essentially, then that's how empires die.
Well, I mean, no empire lasts forever, but a competent one will always ensure that it has a policy or it's acting like it will. Because, I mean, if you act like you have an expiration date, then all that you're doing is telling potential enemies to just sit it out and to wait it out. And I think to some extent there are some political thoughts that's out there in regards to the West that if you were, say, a geopolitical rival to the United States, you could potentially bank on political instability and domestic low-level and low-intensity conflict playing out that could potentially wreck or ruin their own international relations standing in regards to the military. I mean, even now with the recruitment levels the way that they are, I mean, there's even been discussions inside Foreign Affairs magazine, which is a part of the Council of Foreign Relations, about, well, what do we do about the all-volunteer force? I mean, do we have discussions about bringing back the draft and so on and so forth, which of course would be, I think that if you were to institute the draft today, you would make the draft riots of the 1860s blush, because they would probably be far worse than what we saw during the Civil War. But those are things that any competent government and state actor has to consider. And I mean, in our own domestic politics, if I were to look at the United States and say, screw this national divorce conversation. If you wanted to look at the country as a whole, all continental 48 plus Hawaii and Alaska, I would look at it and say, well, okay, clearly the polarization of the United States is becoming a significant national security threat because, say, for instance, 2 years from now, right, the United States decides to have the second Mexican-American Civil War. We're going to go after the cartels. We're going to go into Sonora, and we're going to take out, the state of Chihuahua, and we're going to make this place safer for Mexico, safer for the United States, casus belli, etc. So, for instance, say America's polarization continues, and say some, politically conservative white male drone operator that's currently flying sorties down in the Sonoran Desert gets doxxed by, Antifa or any sort of other leftist political organization. And all of a sudden now that person's been doxxed and can be targeted by, say, cartels or other state actors from Mexico, and that person is potentially killed. From a state perspective, that's a huge national security concern, because now all of a sudden, vital operators for your war effort are at risk, not by enemy combatants, but are inadvertently helped out by political foes inside of your own country. And the same way that we've kind of seen examples of that, where
I think you cut out there. But something I did want to discuss with regards to that, the competency level there. It can be maintained as long as the elites can continue to put on the bread circuses, pretty much. However, once they may lose that ability, that's when you actually might see change. However, the incompetency of elites is extremely hard to actually punish in our system at all. It's almost non-existent because you actually can't, because the system cloaks who's actually in charge. So there is no accountability in the system. It always is just passing the buck based on this guy in the White House who could be X, Y, or Z, and it really doesn't matter because the deep state is ultimately still in charge of deciding how things will be run, and it's ultimately why responsibility, holding people accountable, is extremely difficult. I believe he did drop out of our conversation there, but let me just respond to you real quick since he's gone. Kingdom of Inland, I disagree that we're late stage Rome. We're more like the period transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. I mean, I might agree with you in a sense, but I just don't think we have the men, the strong men or competent leaders to really pull that off. But I could be wrong. We could be heading towards transition from the Republic to an empire, but I don't think so.
I mean, that's the big debate, has always been Caesarism, and there are some that are optimistic about it, others not so much. I apologize for dropping out there.
No,
Rural internet can always be a pain in the rear. But yeah, I mean, that would be the principal question. Are we heading towards a strong man, or are we heading towards more of a internal sort of squabble, which would threaten international positions abroad?
I don't know. We'll have to see how that goes, but I think either way, the Caesar question gets more interesting as it becomes more and more of a possibility of occurring.
Oh, it's certainly more discussed in that regard. Yeah.
Kingdom of Inland asks an interesting question. How do you think Texas becoming an independent republic would affect geopolitics? Well, I'll leave that to the Texan who's here. Prude, what do you think would happen if the Republic of Texas was reborn right now?
Well, it would certainly face a lot of concerns about, well, one, what do you do with all of the federal
Californians who are there?
Well, I was thinking more of the federal military infrastructure that currently exists. I mean, it has some of the I believe it has the most military bases per capita in regards to both the military, Navy, and Air Force, and the rest of our armed forces inside there. You have everything from Laughlin Air Force Base, Houston, and its naval and air stations, plus NASA, plus other things with regarding to the United States Space Force and cybersecurity. Then you have like places like Fort Bliss, Fort Hood. But let's assume that those are your guys, right? It would be, geopolitically speaking, it would be rather well off in regards to access to, say, the United States in regards to international or at least, bilateral trade. Trade with Mexico would most likely be happy to continue on the same way that it has. I mean, you still have El Paso, which has historically always been a major trading route, even before the United States, or Texas was a thing. So you'd have access to Ciudad Juarez and international trade that goes, of course, into New Mexico and the rest of the Texas as well as the United States. You'd have access to the Gulf of Mexico, so you could have ports of entry for international trade domestically and internationally. And then, I mean, you'd have to have a standing military in a lot of ways. So can it be relatively competent would be the question. Those are always fun questions, but I mean, in terms of its geography, access to the Gulf of Mexico significantly puts Texas in a better position geopolitically than, say, a landlocked state like Nebraska.
Well, I think another interesting thing about Texas is that I actually learned this as a fact recently. A lot of our army comes from Texas. A lot of the recruited army, Marines, they come from the state of Texas. So Texas produces a lot of our high quality, we'll say tier 1 and tier 2 troops, who you want, men who actually will fight competently in a war. So I think that would be an aid to Texas side, is the fact they have a lot of strong men who are still patriotic, as we see by recruiting data, based on preferences to serve in the army.
Well, those things are definitely going to play a role. I mean, one can't underestimate sort of Texas's energy capacity. I mean, the Midland Odessa area, of course, is well known for its oil and shale gas extraction, but not to mention it's also that area. There's a lot of flat land that you can take advantage of for air power as well. So, I mean, there's plenty of wind and air power that also exists here. And I mean, the state of Texas is the most energy productive state in regards to, in 2021, it produced 12% of net electricity generation inside of the entire union. Florida was a second place, I think, at 8%. But it does illustrate that you have a diverse biome in regards to, you have everything from deserts to forests. For lumber, you have access to good rivers and lakes. So you have a natural stock of a variety of things needed for a domestic manufacturing industry, hunting, agriculture, energy extraction, international trade, by trilateral trade with either the United States or Mexico. I mean, there is a lot of geographic providence of the current borders of Texas today that if it were to be a sovereign territory, it would do well. The question becomes then, what's its
OPEC
relationship?
membership.
Well, that and its relationship with, say, nations that aren't directly bordering it, like the United States and Mexico, because the moment you start getting too friendly with other countries that the United States would consider a rival, then you've got problems. In the same way that the current American State Department is probably increasingly concerned about Canada's relationship with China.
I mean, I think they would be concerned, but I mean, they have such I don't even know what the word to describe this guy. They have such a soy boy in charge, basically, and basically Canada is a province of the U.S. I don't see that ever changing. They're just far too cucked and consume way too much soy for that to ever change. I'm sorry to the Canadians out there, but you are just an American province. At the end of the day.
The last election that led to Trudeau having a minority government had also accepted the election results despite documented evidence of Chinese meddling in the elections, in the same way that America has problems with, say, China buying up vast swaths of American farmland close towards American air bases for potential aspects of surveillance. You also have Confucius centers. You have well-known professors out of Stanford University that have been accused and arrested for espionage on behalf of the Chinese government. So when we look at these things, we have to consider that warfare and international relations, as we know it, is also going to see the securitization aspect play a role there. So you have to deal with things like, well, how much influence can I allow them to exert domestically? How much property can I allow them to buy? And what powers am I willing to invoke for a state of exception, to borrow a little bit from Carl Schmitt? But yeah, I mean, we call these places sort of, U.S. principalities and so on. But I mean, there's still a lot of agency that these countries have and can be subject to the same kind of, meddling that America is kind of well known for on the world stage.
I just don't see our neighbors up north as it's hard to see them as anything more than American puppet state. I'm sorry, but I laugh when people say that we should take Canada seriously.
You should, just not for the reasons that many people would think, whether it's due to the Chinese or also because if I were to look at the world as it is and say, let's take climate change, for example, for a variety of reasons, which I'm not going to get into for YouTube purposes, there is, of course, a substantial change in the Arctic Circle up north. I mean, which, of course, Canada and the United States are part of the Arctic Council. But if I were to be interested in maintaining or utilizing polar and Arctic routes for trade, especially the Arctic Circle, I have to contend with the fact that Russia is also a major player there, and so is Canada. I would want to have Canada geopolitically on my side, or to have a good relationship with them to ensure that their access and waterways towards the Arctic Circle is accessible to us, not just through Alaska, but also through their territory as well. And I do think that the Arctic Circle will be an area in which the United States and other powers that are closer to it geographically, like Russia, will be interested in the next, and for the remainder of this century.
Definitely, I think the Arctic trade route will become extremely important in terms of global trade as the Arctic becomes more and more accessible to shipping more times of the year. And you just like icebreaker technology. You were talking about that. Gets better and better. Like that becomes less of an issue, and you can consistently have a supply line of trade going through and through there, and it cuts down on the route significantly in terms of getting goods from China to Europe, or goods from China and Asia to America, we'll say, or oil possibly as well.
I mean, those are all potential avenues. I mean, nations are always going to be looking for other ways to trade with one another. And I talked about this back in June of 2021. I think this was one of the earlier geopolitical episodes that I've done, but it was discussing the importance of the Arctic trade routes and where that may be an area of great power competition, because the Russians are the only ones that have nuclear-powered icebreakers, where the rest of the world is still primarily focused on diesel-fueled ones, which of course have issues with regards to the ice and extreme cold and temperatures. And so I do think that the Arctic is going to be an area in which Russia may use it as an opportunity to bypass certain naval patrolled areas, or to simply get around customs and shipping lanes that may have the backing of the U.S. Navy, or sort of Western-backed sanctions regimes when it comes to, say, shipping reinsurance and things like that.
Definitely, I think we'll see that more and more as time progresses in that theater. But let's talk about, as we kind of end towards the stream, let's talk about some more interesting things we see in geopolitics right now. So recently we've seen with the Syria situation, Putin trying to organize a meeting between Bashar al-Assad and Erdogan of Turkey to finally put an end to this war, which has lasted more than a decade now. What do you think about that? Do you think that we're closer towards a peace process in Syria finally, and that we'll probably have to withdraw those troops that we have still there?
The question would really be that not so much of American influence in there, but also what does, say, a nation state like Turkey have to play a role? Turkey, of course, is sort of this precarious leveraging one party over the other as its foreign policy, whether it's, say, the issues over demographics with the migrant crisis, that they have millions that are sort of being held on agreement on their end. That doesn't go into Europe. Erdogan's famously talked about that, or utilizing, say, the issue of religion. There's a recent burning of the Quran that, of course, Erdogan had sort of snapped at those trying to enter NATO, because it had taken place in a Scandinavian country, and they're trying to join NATO. So those things all are going to play a factor. Not to mention, of course, the biggest issue is well, what do you do about the Kurds? Because, of course, Turkey has been playing with the quote-unquote Kurdish question since the 1970s with the Kurdish Workers' Party. The United States has been supporting groups affiliated with them, whether it's the YPG and other Kurdish fighters in the area. So has other Western countries. And so I don't know if we're going to see relative peace in the region. However, given the recent earthquakes in Turkey and the communication between Erdogan and Assad, I think that we're going to see a page turn, maybe not this year, but in the latter half of the 2020s. I think that the country will try its best to recover, although it has been demographically tanked by just the sheer displacement of peoples, unless the West decides to repatriate them. But those are some interesting challenges that lie ahead for any sort of potential peace, rehabilitation, and political stability for Syria, and who may potentially succeed al-Assad.
Potentially, that's very interesting. We'll have to see, but definitely Iran has benefited from our extreme mess ups in that region. Syria and Iran have gotten way closer, and that's been the case since Hafez al-Assad took control of Syria in the 1970s. But our meddling hasn't helped the situation either. If our primary concern was limiting Iranian influence in the Middle East.
Well, you also have, well, I mean, that too, but I mean, even now, in the wake of the power vacuum that was created when America left Iraq in around 2011, 2012, of course, the Islamic State, and in turn, Iran's political influence inside of Iraq is stronger than it has been in several years. And in doing so, they've sort of put themselves in a pretty good position. I mean, this is the same thing that we're seeing with Iran's relationship with Russia, munition centers and Iranian-produced drones and equipment in the ongoing Russian-Ukraine conflict, but also that Iran has a pretty close relationship to China as well. So, I mean, I do think that we're going to see more of the Middle Eastern, Eurasia region be this prominent hotspot, not so much for, say, the United States and its interests, although certainly that the USG will get involved, but because you are going to see the interplay between China and Russia play out with their own strategic interests in the Middle East and former Soviet republics. So that would be an area I think that anyone who wants to look at how the world may be going in the next 20 to 30 years would pay close attention to where that part of the world is going.
Definitely, because of its central location between great powers. It will be interesting to see who's gaining primary influence in that region. We see a quite bit major battle between Russia, Turkey, and to a lesser extent China over who can control the Central Asian states and control the mountain regions and kind of that uranium supply that comes out of Kazakhstan, as well as that Caspian Sea natural gas, which has been gaining prominence due to our recent actions in the Baltic Sea and cutting Russia off from the European market. Kind of moving into Azerbaijan as quite a big supplier, actually, of European goods through Turkey's pipelines.
Yeah, I mean, that region is definitely going to be an area that we're going to have to pay much more attention to in the future. I mean, I can't imagine us not wanting to, at least the government, I should say. I mean, us ourselves included. But I mean, yeah, we're definitely going to have a major role to play there. And that's a discussion I think that we're going to see more often. I mean, we're seeing this especially here in the sort of foreign policy establishment, the discussion over deglobalization, a more stratified economy where nations try to reindustrialize and securitize themselves. And in doing so, I think that other nations will be trying to do the same to bypass sanctions regimes or spheres of influence that are not friendly to their level of trade. And so whether that's new types of corridors, Belt and Roads initiatives, or simply trying to appreciate ways in which they can encourage their own trade, such as the Middle Corridor or the international north-south transport corridor, all these sort of networks that can act as viable alternatives to regions will be a thing that we see play out very much in the future. And Lord only knows where it's going to go. But, paying attention to how nations operate, where geography plays a major role, and spheres of influence are going to be vital in our understanding of how the international system evolves.
Definitely. Geography is one of those things that doesn't really change, and you can always count on it kind of determining your position on the chessboard and kind of your strengths and weaknesses and what moves you can make in your geographic neighborhood. But with that being said, Kingdom of Vinland brings up an interesting comment. I think Alaska's geography would make it quite powerful internationally due to its location, geographically and natural resources. It's the most naturally beautiful state. Well, I definitely agree about the natural beauty. Um, that's an interesting thing you mentioned about Alaska's geography because due to hostile NATO and Soviet relationships, Alaska's airport was actually one of the most used to kind of counteract Soviet airspace and that blocking out from Western countries. So I think that definitely is an interesting thing you mentioned there.
I mean, Alaska is, of course, I mean, it's been an area that it saw kind of the only Japanese quote unquote occupation of sovereign territory was, of course, in sort of the Aleutian Islands under that part of Alaska. But also, yes, during the Cold War, it was a major concern and attack vector. There's still plenty of early warning stations that are still there, and a vast amount of mineral and oil resources that are still untapped, both for environmental reasons, but also because they can, mainly for that reason and regulatory burdens. But yeah, I mean, Alaska is still a vitally important area. So what was once originally laughed at as Secretary of State Seward's icebox has been, one of the most strategically important places for the United States, both as a mechanism to have territory closer to a geopolitical foe, access to the Pacific in ways that most people wouldn't expect, and secondly, or thirdly, I should say, just a place in which we do have a vast degree of natural resources as well as military resources to take advantage of.
Not to mention the fact that we cut Canada's Pacific coast just that extra more, which is it feeds my American patriotism to see that. You love to see that, but we like our friends to the north, but we like taking their coastline as much as possible in unfair treaties. Although to be fair, that was the Russians who created those borders and sold them to us.
Well, it was sort of a good deal in the end and in the long run, especially in 2023.
With that being said, Mr. Prudentialist, as we kind of close out the stream, is there anything you'd like to shill, kind of promote before we hang off today?
Well, if you're not subscribed to the channel, I would always recommend that. You can find me over on YouTube as The Prudentialist. And if you want to know what I'm keeping up with, I'm on Twitter, Telegram, Odyssey, Rumble, Substack, and I'm all over the place. But you can find me at findmyfriends.net/theprudentialist, and you'll find access to all links there. And I will be live this Thursday and Saturday afternoon. Got a lot of great stuff coming up for you all, both on the geopolitical front with some literature reviews. We're going to be going over some books and articles, but at the same time, I'm going to have hopefully a very interesting guest on this Saturday. So stay tuned for more announcements. And thank you so much, Mr. Populist, for having me on.
Definitely was a pleasure. I am also on Find My Friends too as well if you'd like to check out my links as well. But with that being said, remember everyone, the light can't last forever. Keep your hopes up and have a great rest of your night.